Now let's make this app responsive to user input. To do that, I'll use the provider package, which will help us manage the state of our app. To set up provider, I'll first look up provider in pub.dev and then copy the dependency here. Back in the project, I'll come down to pubspec.yaml, and now we need to paste this in under dependencies, so just in here, and then I'll run pubget, and now we should have provider in this project. Now I want to set up a model class that extends a change notifier. So here I will go new Dart file, and I'll name this controller. So this is going to basically serve as our nerve center. I'll type class controller and then extends, and I'll write change notifier, and that's going to allow us to call the notify listeners method, which will dispatch notifications. Now we want this controller that extends a change notifier to be accessible throughout the project. So let's set up our provider. So I'll go to main, and we want to set this right at the top of our widget tree. I'll right click on my app, wrap with widget, and I'll type in MultiProvider. And the reason I'm typing in MultiProvider is we will create multiple providers. So here, this takes a list of providers, and now we can create our first object to expose to a whole project. So to do that, we'll use a change notifier provider. And here, we'll create our object. So the controller will be accessible throughout the project. And this will make managing our state really easy if we concentrate all of our key data in one place, which is the controller. So we also need to import the libraries. And now that's set up. So now we can come back to our controller. So the first bit of data we want to track is what tile the user is currently on. So when they start the game, they'll start on tile 0, and every time they enter a letter, they'll progress to the next tile. So I'll create a new variable of type int, current tile, and I'll set that to 0. Now I'll create a method that is called every time the user taps a key. So I'll name this set key tapped. It'll take in a string, name this value. Now there are basically 3 types of keys the user can press. They can press any letter on the keyboard, enter, and also back. So let's set up some if statements to deal with those. So the first one, if value equals enter, else if value equals back, else, which will be any other key on the keyboard. Okay, so let's put in some logic. First of all, if the user taps a letter, current tile should increment by 1. On the same note, if the user taps back, we should decrease the current tile by 1. So to increment by 1, I've typed plus plus to indicate that, and to decrease it by 1, I've typed minus minus here. And if the user enters enter, then they probably want to check a word. So here we'll shortly create a method that checks the word, but in the meantime I'll just type in check word. Now let's build on this further. So the user should only be able to increment a tile if they're not already at the end of a row. So I'll type in if current tile is less than 5, then they can increment current tile, i.e. enter another letter. And the same note, if they're at the start of the row, they should not be able to go back. So if current tile is greater than 0, then they can decrease current tile by 1. And also they should only be able to enter, i.e. check a word, if they have entered 5 letters. So if current tile equals 5. Now let's create a print function and test this. So down here I'll write print current tile, and now we need to call this method every time a key is pushed. So let's go to our keyboard row. So here in our keyboard row, we'll go to inkwell. Now inside our onTap function, we can use provider to call our new method that we've created in the controller. To do that, we'll use provider.of, then we'll take in the controller as a type in angle brackets, And now we have access to all the properties and methods in our controller. So we want to access this method, setKeyTapped. We want to call this method. And here we need to pass in the value. So we can pass that straight in because that's a string. So here, provider, we'll call this method. Now we only want to read controller, so here I'll set listen to false because we do not want to listen to changing values in here. So now let's test that. I'll do a hot restart. I'll tap A, current tile 1, tap A again, current tile 2. Okay, cool. So that's progressing along. And when we get to 5, then we cannot progress any further. Now let's go back one, check the back button. Cool, we can go back to current tile 4. Now if we go back to current tile 5 and I press enter, we can now check Word. So that's printed out that function. Okay, cool. So let's go back to our controller. So we have this basic logic here working. So we have one small problem, and that is this is only working on the first row. So we need to be able to have this logic update to take into account when the user progresses on to additional rows. So to do that, let's create another int, and I'll name this current row, set this as 0, and here where the user presses enter, the current row should increment by 1 also. And we also need this value here to update depending on what row the user's on. So what we can do is we can just multiply that by the current row. So current tile equals 5, and we can type in times current row. Now we have a slight issue, is that current row starts at 0 instead of 1. So to get around that, we'll just put current row in some brackets and then write +1 here. So now that'll read 5 times 0 plus 1 is 1, so that'll be 5. The next time, 5 times 2, so that'll be 10. Okay, so we can also use that same logic down here. I'll just paste that straight in. So current tile can increase as long as we're not on the final tile of the row. And then down here, I'll also copy this in, but we want to check we're on the first column of each row. So here I'll just write -5. So that'll check that we're on the very first grid tile of each row. Okay, cool. So now we should be able to progress through the game grid by grid and also row by row. So let's check this with our print function. So I'll also type and current row. Now I'll do a hot restart. So let's type in SSSS. Now we can't progress any further on that current row. Let's check that word, and we can then progress on to the next row. Cool. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we cannot progress, and we can see current tile 10 and current row is now 1. Now let's press enter. Awesome. Current tile 10 and current row 2, which is the third row. In the next video, we will get the keyboard working so letters can be typed into the grid tiles.